So have you, since we did that, have you thought of something?
A bit of a think. I have, yes.
And what is that?
It's effects-based thinking.
It's what, sorry?
Effects-based thinking.
Uh-huh. What is that?
Shall I tell you a little story of it? So the effects-based approach comes from military, or that's certainly where I learned it. But sort of if we wind the clock back a number of years back to, I think, 2009. So I was on my second operational tour as a young infantry commander. My first tour of Afghanistan. So I was in Helmand province in a place called Musakala, which is in the sort of northern, slightly more mountainous area of the province. And we were in a role where, effectively we were going out on fighting patrols every single day as a very small team of UK soldiers with, about 10 of us alongside about 30 Afghan soldiers. So we were very much partnering and working hand in hand. So we ended up coming into this particular firefight in one area. They had these quite heavy machine guns that meant we were within their range, but they were outside the range of most of our weapons, which is never a good place to be in, where they can hit you and you can't hit them. And I had with me a what's called a fire support element. So we were all from the infantry, but we had this soldier bombardier from the Royal Artillery, who his job was to call in, rockets and bombs from helicopters, planes, and from guns that were very, very far back. And so what I said to him, what I wanted to happen was, we had an enemy that I couldn't hit directly. So what I said to him was, neutralize the enemy position. The army's very clear; it's got effects, and those effects have got clear descriptions of what they mean. And what it meant was, he was able to use his expertise to do what needed to be done. Now, it's very common, in all scenarios, we can sort of think about using our own expertise to be very specific on what we wanted to happen. I could have turned around and said, can you get a plane to drop something on that? Or can you get an attack helicopter to come and fire on it? Or fire this munition, fire that munition. What he did was initiate the second UK launch of a specific missile called the Exacta missile. I'd never heard of it. I didn't know it existed. It was the second use of it in Afghanistan by UK forces. So I could have never known to ask him for that. But he used his expertise to bring in a particular camera-guided missile that very precisely neutralized the enemy position. And that's the way that I think about most things. I've continued that in the business world, where rather than trying to seeing a problem and going specifically into a niche initiative that could help solve the problem, I try and think more broadly about what is the effect that I need to create within this area. And once I'm clear about not only the effect, but multiple effects that might have to happen in a sequence, it's only then that we then start looking at what's the best initiative to use within that. And does that initiative continue when I'm thinking about all these effects? So you might have if you were thinking about recruitment, if you're thinking about how you, from a workforce planning perspective, how you might create the right kind of workforce, you might think in terms of, I talk about 7 workforce planning levers. These are effects of buy, build, borrow, bind, bounce, bot, and balance. So I might think, okay, well, what I need to do is I've got a problem I've got insufficient types of this worker. So I need to bind them to try and limit them leaving. I need to borrow capability in order to bring in people on a temporary basis to help bridge a current gap. I need to buy people. I need to bring in people on a more permanent basis, and I need to build capability. But I think about it in terms of those effects rather than going, well, what we need is a graduate scheme and going straight into the details. Because I might go, well, having come up with a great idea like a graduate scheme and starting to follow it through, well, what do we know about graduates? They all tend to be a similar age. They're all going to be of similar levels of seniority and experience. So they're all going to want to promote at the same time. They're all going to want to move on at the same time. So I need to make sure that if I'm then going into initiative, it then works all the way through the sequence of levers that I need to pull. But the main beauty of it is, but that by providing, by looking at it in terms of the effects, I can then look at others. I can then look at experts within the field for their guidance on what do they think is going to be the best initiative that works in this scenario. Because you can broadly think in terms of effects. You don't need to be an expert in those particular areas. And then you can use people's expertise, not only to create a better solution, but to create a solution that they're prepared to own and execute on your behalf. So I think, a lot of, when I was sort of thinking back about what makes, what allows me to be successful in what I do, it is that ability to just be able to think about things in terms of the effect I want to create. And then where possible, relying on other people's expertise for the specifics of what needs to be done.
So it sounds a bit like what I think other people would call outcome-based or outcome-oriented thinking.
Yes.
What's the end result that we're looking for, as opposed to how we get there? And it also sounds like very much what I've covered on management and leadership development programs in terms of the principles of delegation, which is we create a result and then we leave people to apply their individual skills and expertise in pursuit of that result and trust that they will do it differently than you will, but that's okay. So it sounds like, if we break this down, it sounds like, firstly, you've talked about this as something that was present in the army, but it sounds like you were maybe predisposed to thinking in this way. It wasn't something that you just learned from scratch. There was something already in your life experience that made this make sense to you, made this easy and effective for you. And if we're to try and pass this way of thinking on to somebody else, then we've got to understand, well, how do we define what the effect is? Because the thing that struck me about the language that you used of neutralize the position, neutralizing that form as a verb, it's an action. So it sounds like you're telling the guy what to do in terms of action output, but but because of the shared language that you've created, he understood that as an intent, a result.
Yeah.
So does that mean we've got to first establish a common language to describe what those results are so that we can use those shortcuts?
Not necessarily. The army has done that. So what to just a random person on the street might sound like three similar things, which are destroy, defeat, and neutralize, might sound like the same thing, and they're not. The military's got very clear definitions of this is what destroy means, this is what defeat means, and this is what neutralize means. Very different. In more of a business setting, it'd be lovely if there was a shared language, but that's not reality. But I think to be able to be clear on what that means to you, but it's about talking about the outcome and the effect. It's about talking about almost the what and not the how. And the how is then down.
If we think of a retail example, I mean, it's not perhaps, I don't know, maybe it is a good example at the moment. There's a lot of retailers closing down, which is creating opportunities for others, and the retail landscape is changing. So what I can imagine is at some board level, some executive or a states officer or somebody is saying, right, we need to open 6 new branches this year, 6 new stores this year, and they're going to be in those towns. And so there's kind of an order that says, go and open a branch in Hull, or go and open a branch in York, or whatever. And a whole bunch of people will make all of that. They know exactly how to make that happen. They know how to go and find a property, where it's going to be, how to negotiate rent, how to do the fit out, how to do the marketing, how to do all the law. So there are people who know how to do their bit in all of that. Yeah. Because what they will have is a manual that says, this is what our outlet, our store, our restaurant, whatever looks like. This is what the staff look like. This is the template for how you hire the staff, and all of that is prepared. So for that kind of business where the business model is about reproducibility, it sounds like they've perhaps already got that common language there, whereas
Yes.
businesses that are maybe more reactive or don't have that so much, where every project or every deal looks a little bit different. Do you think
Yeah.
there are elements still that they can find that make it easier for managers or leaders to describe that end result?
I think if it's done as part of you'd almost do that up front when you started to think about the strategy. When you start using some of that language throughout. So when you start talking about why does the organization exist? What's its purpose or vision? What does the organization do? What are its goals and objectives? What's the strategy? I would hope that kind of language would come out to start providing that framework of, when we might shortcut it as simplify. Actually, when we talk about simplify, this is what we mean. This is how we think about simplify. So that then, if we say, can we simplify that? Everyone's then got everyone can have the common understanding then to be able to reproduce that same effect in different ways in different areas.
Right. So can you think of an example of something that you've delegated recently that you'd be happy to talk about?
Ooh, trying to think of things. I mean, when we've sort of done things around around the pandemic and working out what things needed to be done, in line with the workforce, then we sort of did something very similar. So we created this framework that talked about sort of key broader effects and stages that we wanted to create as the way in which someone might flow from working in a normal scenario to becoming furloughed to being redeployed and then returning back to their own role, appreciating that people might flow from furlough to a redeployment opportunity and back to furlough. And so rather than, the start point was to be able to say, broadly, let's name these stages. Let's talk about that high level view of how things would go through. And then, this was predominantly being done by a resourcing function, and I don't pretend to be a recruiter by any stretch of the imagination. But then what it allowed us to do was then talk to those who were engaged in recruitment to then go, okay, well, what do you now think would be the specifics of this? What would we need to consider at this? What would be important to you at this point? Doing the same with some of the HR leaders within the business, but doing that up front on the basis of something high level rather than going in there with something ridiculously detailed that we'd come up with that might not necessarily work through. So it was very much a case of collaborating and delegating in that way to say, okay, you take over at this point, and then with your thoughts, and then let's come back into it.
So it sounds like very broadly there's a sequence of events which is something has happened externally which requires a response.
Yes.
Somebody figures out what that response is going to look like, and then we've got to communicate that to people who are actually going to implement the details of making that happen, filling in forms, updating HR records, opening stores, closing stores, whatever it might be. There are arms and legs on the ground doing things. And where you are in the middle, you're aware of that external situation, but it's not you from a strategic level that's determining what that response is. So I'm guessing the first step for you is talking to leaders in the business to find out what is the effect that you're looking for. So they're saying, oh my God, this terrible thing, we've got to react. And you're saying, yes, what does the result of our response need to look like? So how do you go about having that conversation?
A lot of it comes down to understanding people, understanding your stakeholders, and understanding what matters, and then trying to get them into a position where they're able to articulate changes to specific objectives. So normally you've already got, your objectives are clear. This is what needs to be achieved within this time frame. So the organization wants to achieve, a 20% profit growth by, within 3 years. You've then got strategic elements that might say, well, we're looking at growth in profits. Part of that's going to be driven by, we want to increase revenues. Part of that is going to be done by, we want to reduce costs. So it's not simply we want to increase revenues by 20%. That's going to generate the increase in the profits by 20%. It might be, well, we want to increase the revenue. The maths might not work, by the way. We might want to increase revenues by 10% and reduce costs by 10%. That gives us our 20%. So when you understand how those things, what is the strategy and what are the objectives and how do they connect, then the question is, has the situation changed? So though there might be external factors that have changed, is what we are trying to do as an organization changed? Once you can get them to articulate whether it's changed or not, then all you're trying to do is go, okay, so let's work out how we continue doing what we do, appreciating that execution will have changed because of COVID or whatever. Or it might be, well, fundamentally, COVID has been so significant to a business that the entire landscape has fundamentally changed and we are changing our objectives. Let's think about what we want those objectives to be. So then that helps us do that. What I'm trying to get
to is what's going on inside your head at that moment that you're having that see, you've got your stakeholders, you understand what their needs are. They're trying to articulate some result or something that they want to change, and they don't necessarily know how that's going to happen, but they know what the objective is. And what you're trying to do is ask them enough questions to be able to create a plan that can be executed, as you said, that other people can own and execute on your behalf. Mm. So how do you know when you've asked that stakeholder enough questions that you've gotten a clear enough picture in your own head to be able to get somebody else to own and execute that on your behalf?
Probably on the basis of speaking to multiple stakeholders. And getting to a point where you've got to be comfortable. One of the other elements that I sort of hold on to quite well, which is the ability to just make assumptions, not just to make blind assumptions and say, well, we'll execute on that basis, but to be able to make assumptions, understand that you and recognize that you are making an assumption, and to recognize the risks of those assumptions. So what is the likelihood that I'm wrong? And what's the impact that I'm wrong, and what do I need to look out for in the future that will indicate whether I am right or wrong? Because you can never get something, you can't get a perfect download of someone's brain and feelings. So it's asking enough questions of enough places to get a decent sense of the ground truth, and then recognizing what assumptions you are naturally making on top of that.
So if you can think of a specific conversation that you've had with somebody along these lines, what was the point at which in that conversation you felt like, yeah, I've got enough information now to move on?
I think because I've sort of maintained, tend to maintain relationships with the stakeholders, then it means that it can come about very quickly, very quickly in a conversation, depending on, how things changed, or has our strategy and objectives changed, not the execution, not the tactics, not the execution, because of that always changes. So once I can get clarity on have things changed or have they not, if objectives haven't changed and the strategy hasn't changed, then that's enough. Then I can sort of go away and look at the effects, because then what's changed is down at the execution. So let's get the experts to understand how their execution has changed. If you end up with fundamental changes to objectives and strategy, then you can end up in very lengthy conversations that you're then going to have to talk to people at very different levels to say, okay, well, specifically, what has changed? Have our goals changed? And with objectives being the smart version of those goals, there's a metric, there's a time frame. Has the time frame changed? Has the metric changed? What is the quantum? It might require a lot more conversations, and indeed a stakeholder might not know, and it might require having to reassess and look at data, particularly where you've got change that's happening, that has happened very fast and very dynamically, as COVID has. It will require quite significant conversations with multiple people in order that you can get to a shared view of what the new objectives are, because they probably don't lie with a single person making that call.
So in the case of something like COVID, the external environment has changed. The business objectives, let's say for the sake of argument, haven't changed, and therefore you know how to change whatever the execution plan looks like in order to maintain those objectives during something like this. And I guess there will come then the situation where you can then see you can't maintain the same objectives, and then presumably you communicate that back up to the stakeholders.
Yes, exactly.
We can't maintain these profit levels or this productivity or whatever under these conditions, and then they've got to rethink.
We've got to say, well, in order to maintain these levels, because there's probably a number of different things in there, and it might be something along the lines of, well, we can still achieve the profit, but we can't achieve it through cost reduction, which is one of our strategic aims. So it might be all of it changes, or it might be a key strand that says these two are no longer compatible, because actually, within a COVID environment, we are now going to have to increase our spending in order to generate the same revenue. So the only way, we will struggle to increase our margin, so we can still achieve this objective of the profit, but we're going to have to do that through revenue, not through costs.
So it really does sound to me like what you're investing time in is building a shared language with people of what profit means, what 20% means, what open means, what close means, what execute means. So that when you talked about getting to know the stakeholders and getting to understand them, that seems to be very much along these lines, that when they say, this is what I want you to achieve, you understand exactly what it is that they're looking at, what the end result is going to look like for them. So it seems like one of the key things that you're doing is investing time in creating a shared language for those objectives when you're not in the situation where you need to be taking action.
So yes, that's certainly part of it, in sort of trying to create that a language that you recognise, and almost the ability to be able to translate from HR speak to a business language, the language of your stakeholders, and be able to then translate that back to those who might be executing either from an operational side, an HR side, finance side, and estate side, because everyone's professions naturally generate their own language. So there is an element of being able to translate that through. And it's why I always, work, predominantly being within HR, I still focus my energies on understanding the business language, because that is the primary language of the stakeholders. And I think it also comes down to sort of this idea of, and you sort of recognize it from a personal perspective of, the Oracle of Delphi, know thyself. And I try and do that for the business. If you see yourself as the organization, when you say know thyself, actually it's know the organization. What is the organization? what drives it, how is it structured, who are the people, what is the organization trying to achieve. And if you understand all those things and continue to recognize when those things are changed, if you're doing personal coaching, you say, well, how do you act when you're stressed? How do you act when things are well? Well, it's the same for an organization. How does the organization act when it's stressed? How does the organization act when it's well and performing? When you start to recognize those things, then actually that becomes a fundamental basis of how then you can interact, translate, question in order to be able to draw out what is the effect I need to create.
Okay. So I'd like to try and run through this now and see what happens and observe what you do in this. So I've got to think up a plan. So you can imagine I'm a stakeholder.
Catastrophic end of the world. Yes.
Yeah, I'm a stakeholder, and I'm going to come up with some newfangled idea for something. So actually, one of the things I've been aiming to get around to for a few weeks now is getting my own podcast series off the ground. And I just seem to have so much else to do that finding the time to sit down and start interviewing people and recording for it's has been quite a challenge. So if I was a stakeholder and I was saying to you, okay, so I want to get this podcast up and running, mm-hmm. and you're the guy who's going to go off and bring all the different bits together and make this happen.
Yeah.
Have you got enough information in what I've just told you to be able to go and do that?
No, there's a key question we need to start everything with.
Uh-huh.
Why? So you're saying that you want to launch a podcast. Why do you want to launch the podcast?
Well, because everyone's got a podcast these days, and people are saying, you've got to have a podcast. So I've got to jump on that bandwagon.
And what will the podcast enable you to do?
Don't know. Talk to some interesting people and have people watching it on YouTube or listening to it on whatever thing. They'd be informed.
Okay, so if you were having conversations with people and having the conversations with the interesting people, could you do that without it being on YouTube? So are you seeking the interaction, or are you seeking YouTube?
So I do have interesting conversations with people anyway, but they don't go any further than the two people who are talking. So just to step out of this conversation for a moment, just to reflect on what you've just done there, you were cross-referencing to try and take out variables.
Yeah.
So it's going to be out on YouTube and whatever. Why is that important? You were taking that out of the equation to see what's left, and what was left revealed a new bit of information. So you're doing a lot of cross-referencing.
Yeah. So yes.
Variables.
So where people have got, so what you've got is, so you're coming with a specific initiative in mind. So you're not sort of starting thing of I want to. So where this might go to is I want to create a podcast. Why? Because what that will do is help generate a revenue stream that will lead to sales of X, Y, and Z. So what you might be starting with is saying, so it could be the other way around, where you said, I've got a new business that I'm starting, where we're running masterclasses in NLP to make people into NLP masters. And what I want to be able to do is to generate revenue. Working it that way, it may take us all the way through that. If we spoke to an expert on marketing, they'd say, well, actually what you need is a podcast. That's approaching it from the effect down.
It's interesting because what
the other way round is almost
this is that you've kind of recognized that I've come in at the tail end of a self-diagnosis process. And what you're trying to do is backtrack me to what is the problem I'm trying to solve.
Yes.
So I'm trying to increase revenue in a service business.
Yes.
And I've heard that content marketing is a really good idea, and a podcast is a good idea to do that. So let's have a podcast.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing most people in most businesses working at this level will have had requests like this.
That's exactly what. So it will be, they've done it in another business. They've seen another organization do it. They've been to a conference or they've seen something online. Someone has been talking about something that they've done in their organization. For some, it is what I will use as the pejorative, stealing other people's artificial grass. So it's why organizations got beanbag chairs. Well, Google have got beanbag chairs. Google's successful.
Yes.
Me get beanbag chairs,
Yeah,
me be
box in the
successful.
office, that's a common one.
Absolutely. Let's get ping pong tables. Because people aren't thinking about the effect. People go, it's correlation, not causation. There is a correlation between they are successful, they've got beanbag chairs. If we're successful, we need to get beanbag chairs. And so what I try and do is go, so if we're starting with an initiative, let's work it back up to try and connect it to what is it strategically, that's execution down the bottom. So what's the strategy that aligns to, and above that, what are the goals and objectives, and then is that congruent with your mission? What is it that you do? It's fundamentally for your new business, it is the delivery of training, and then the level above that is your why. What is your purpose and your vision? And if those don't connect on a personal level, we don't like being having that lack of congruence within ourselves. So when we do things personally, we start to feel uncomfortable if we don't have that alignment. And businesses are the same. Organizations, if they are lacking that congruence between everything that they're doing, organization starts to feel uncomfortable. And then it's in an organization, it is bigger and more amplified. So it's very much, if people are starting with an initiative, I'm always trying to work back to what is it, if we do these things, what are they trying to achieve? So let's go back up, because it might be that the podcast is the right way to go. But there might be key things we need to consider that makes this podcast unique to other versions of podcasts that might be seen. It might be that actually, for it to generate revenue, it would need to appear on certain other platforms. So think about, if you sort of start to think about, recruitment as an example, you might say, well, we want to recruit through these channels. Are the people I'm trying to reach on this channel are the people who might want to do NLP on YouTube? Probably, it's a universal platform, but there might be other platforms that they exist on more often. Who is your target audience? I don't pretend to be a marketer, but who is that target audience and what do they respond to? Do they respond to the half hour, the 20-minute, half hour, 40-minute podcast, or do they respond better to a TikTok? Which of those is the important bit? Is it the conversations, or is it fundamentally this is a vehicle for revenue? Okay, well, what are the other options? What is the return on investment on each of those? A TikTok would take you this amount of time. You could do them on a regular basis. A short self video on a LinkedIn would take this much effort and could be done on this basis.
So let me just pause you there, because we're getting quite into the detailed mechanics of putting a podcast together, which is interesting in what's led your train of thought in that direction. It seems that what you're doing is trying to really walk through the detail of making this happen, and potentially looking or testing for gaps. Do I reach a point where I don't know how to do this? I don't know how to make this happen. So if we step back
so that's the bit where, although that's what we're discussing, that's the bit that I'm just speculating. I wouldn't know, and I wouldn't try and advise you because I haven't got a clue. But what I'd want to try. What's interesting
is that you're attempting to walk through and to figure out, am I able to do this with the information that I've got? So just to step back into the example for a moment, if we've now established that this is about growing revenue in a service business, content marketing seems to be a currently popular way to do that. Podcast seems to be a good way to do content marketing. Now we've established what the reason is for the podcast. Do you now have enough information to go off and make that happen?
So what I've got is enough information to be able to go to, if we've said the objective is revenue, or the goal is revenue, and the strategy is social marketing, then what I've got is enough information to be able to, and what I'd also sort of want is an idea about whether any sort of limitations, tolerances, boundaries as to what I'm able to go and do without coming back to you. So assuming I've got none, then I've got enough information to go to someone who understands the social marketing, and come back to you with, this is the best answer, or here are some options that you could consider that will allow you to achieve the end goal. If I've got a bit more latitude of actually, whatever you think is the best way of doing this, go ahead and do that. Then I've got enough to be able to find someone and say, here is a specific, come back with options of how they achieve and show how they align into this particular idea of, I want to generate revenue 20% over the next 2 years.
So I'm getting some clues from you about what motivates you to want to do this and to think like this. And one of the things I'm getting a sense of from you is a sense of personal responsibility, that at no point are you saying, yeah, you want a podcast, yeah, I'll go off and and it's not you that's going to be doing it or pulling all of that together, so you don't care, you're just the man in the middle. You're talking like it's, even though, as you said, getting other people to own and execute on your behalf, you're talking as if you're taking personal responsibility for this.
Yeah, I sort of, I see it as very much of, once I've got it, I'm accountable. So though I may not be responsible for the delivery of some aspect of it, as soon as I'm holding the ball, I'm taking accountability for whatever happens with it.
And there's got to be a payoff for that. There's got to be something which, from inside your life experience, you get in return for taking that responsibility. So with responsibility, we get control, we get recognition, we get the potential to add value. So if you're the person who jumps up and says, even if you don't have the skills and the resources, you're not actually doing the nuts and bolts work. If you're the person who says, I will make that happen, I will take responsibility for that, I'll be accountable for that, what's the payoff for you? What do you get in return for accepting responsibility?
Some often a lot of pain. I find that rewarding. What I enjoy.
What is the reward?
I think there's a personal satisfaction about solving problems.
And what I'm trying to drill down to is exactly what is that reward for you? Is it, if I'm responsible, then I'm in control? Is it, if I'm responsible, then it's I'm the one that's going to look good. I'm the person who's.
So I think there's, yeah. So I think there's definitely a part. Yeah, I think there's definitely a part of if you want me to do it, let me do it. There's only limits to which you're able to control things. But I don't enjoy being almost being a leader who isn't a leader. So yes, you're the person who's in charge, but you've got no ability to be able to do anything. So that being toothless.
something I wrote down earlier that struck me. I got a sense that you really don't like working without purpose.
True.
You don't like just doing something for the sake of it. You need to understand why you're doing it. And we could say that's true of anybody, but I think some people are happy just to do what they're told, and that's, and go home at 5 o'clock and that's it.
Yeah, and I don't need to know. I don't need to know the specific why of one particular thing. It is important for me to work in organisations and with organisations with purpose, and therefore I don't necessarily need to know the why of this particular initiative. If I'm able to look at it and say I can see how that connects into the purpose of the organisation, then it's not. I can get whatever it is, even some sort of, even menial tasks. Okay, that's fine. I can see how it connects. So I don't need to know the specifics of each individual thing I'm asked, but I do have to. I do definitely have to have a purpose behind what I do.
I don't know anybody who likes being micromanaged, but I get the impression that with you, it is a particular.
I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan. And it's why I sort of gave the example that sort of connects back into the military. It's very much there's this concept of mission command. You're given a commander's intent, and then you execute within that intent. You're not given, and you're given boundaries, you're given limitations, you're given tolerances, but then it's off you go and it's yours. Rather than having to be very much micromanaged through things, because for me, then anyone could be if I'm going to be micromanaged by someone, well, anyone could do that. So pick someone who's cheaper. I can deliver if I've got greater latitude, I'm able to deliver far greater value for organizations and far greater return on investment.
Is it about being trusted to deliver?
Yeah, I would think that's quite a big part of it. You need to have that mutual trust. You need to be trusted by them to do that, and you need to trust in them. And it's why, from a values perspective, integrity it's so important to me. It's more than trust. It's about consistency, about the congruence that I mentioned earlier. That has always been, it's one of the Army's core values, but that's always been so important to me whilst I was serving and indeed afterwards.
Well, I think that's interesting, because I think if we asked 10 ex-military people to describe what it is about, they would describe 10 different things. So for you, the fact that you're describing this hierarchy of trust and responsibility and so on, that was what made you well suited to that organization's culture, but you were already predisposed to that before you joined the military. So I think going beyond just trust being important generically, I think for you specifically, being left to do it, being given responsibility, is a sign of trust, that somebody trusts in you. And I wonder if that's the real key to where that sense of satisfaction comes from.
Yeah, it could well be. That sense of I am being recognised as a trusted person, because that's what it is. When you're allowed to do things by yourself, being a little child, being able to play towards the end of the road, you're able to go outside the garden. Then trust is being allowed greater latitude is that sign of trust.
And now bringing that forward into your current role, I would imagine that your career value has been built around your willingness to take responsibility and get the job done, and to establish all of these different things that we've talked about, and to take that hassle, that headache off somebody else, and I'm going to take responsibility, and I'm going to deliver. I'm not going to let it go until it's done and delivered.
Yeah. Let me sort this out for you.
So you've been rewarded for being prepared to take responsibility in return for that show of trust. And I'm going to guess that the jobs that you've had where you were least happy and least fulfilled are the ones where there was a stronger element of micromanagement or restriction or interference, that sort of thing.
Yes, and it's probably less about roles, but more about specific requirements, tasks, things that have come out on those lines where you get specifics of those where that's been the challenge. I think I've been fortunate in that the roles that I've gone into naturally allow me that greater latitude.
One more scenario I'd like to explore with you, and which I'm sure you'll have come across at some point, is you'll be talking to a stakeholder who will be explaining the effect that they're looking for, the outcome or the results, and you'll go off believing that you're now responsible for that, and then you'll find them kind of showing up and poking their noses in, and they find it difficult to leave you to it. So in that environment, in a job where you are otherwise trusted and left to your own devices, you've got one stakeholder or one senior manager who is trying to interfere. How do you deal with that situation or that person?
So I've had great relationships with people who on occasion bring out what I call a long-handled screwdriver. Turn up for the distance, and all of a sudden, they're unscrewing things in front of you, and it's like, well, where's this just come from? And that is down to, and I appreciate that. Some of that might be down to me and the level of trust that they have for me, but it might be about broadly how they act and their own comfort with leaving things entirely out of their hands. Yeah. And I've just recognised that about the stakeholder mix. If one particular stakeholder wishes to be a little more hands-on, then I suppose the question number one is what in terms of stakeholder mapping, what kind of stakeholder are they? Is this someone for whom it is going to be vital for me to still continue to include them, or are they on a 4-quadrant matrix? Are they low in influence and low in power? In which case, thank you. I don't know why you're here. We'll be fine now. Thank you. So with others, it might be a case of it is a necessary evil. But what I try and do is get to a point where I say, what can I provide you usually in terms of update or reporting that will provide you with greater comfort. And usually, if I've got my stakeholder mapping right, then I've been proactive enough that their involvement by surprise is minimized, and that I'm actually providing them proactive updates to provide that level of comfort. So though I've not got full latitude to here's the effect, just disappear away into the ether for a month and come back and tell me when it's done. It's all organizations have got governance and management and need to manage risk. And accountability means that you do need to have risk management and governance measures in there that don't mean that you can just disappear away with a £100 million budget and come back to me in a month. That there needs to be the right governance and checks and balances in place, and that is part and parcel of doing business.
Have you ever gotten to the point with somebody where you've essentially said to them directly, "Get off my back and leave me to do my job"?
I don't think I'll have sort of phrased it in those words. I sort of get to the point of so there, there's certain instances where it's usually it's sort of in areas where someone's thinking, well, collaboration in this particular way can only be a good thing. So let me give you all responsibility and not provide any accountability through that. And then no one's clear where everyone's remit is. And so there's been times where I've said, well, if that's the view, and you've got someone who might be a different stakeholder who's trying to get overly involved in my stuff, then in some cases I'll say, well, to a more senior stakeholder, is this what you want? Are you wanting the involvement of this other stakeholder to this extent? And if the view is, well, yes, well, in that case, let that person do it. So there are times where things have come around where actually, if there is that lack of clarity and no one's keen on that kind of accountability, then I'll say, well, if you've got someone who really wants to be involved in doing this and effectively trying to do what I'm doing, then let them do it.
It sounds like you've learned to renegotiate the conditions, some of those constraints that you've mentioned. It sounds like you've learned to have that sort of intellectual conversation about it. It also sounds like, and it sounds like you've learned to interpret some of that as their own insecurity, that something has provoked their own insecurity and suddenly they feel like they need to get involved in.
I don't try and pretend that I'm the center of anyone's universe. So I tend to sort of believe that people will act in particular ways. There's not necessarily a rhyme or reason of why they do that. I tend to hope it is. I tend to work on the assumption that it isn't a personal slight on their part against me. And so, what of that? What of that can we mitigate? What of that can we take into account?
And yet, at the instinctive emotional level, when that first happens, when they first turn up with their long handle screwdriver, as you put it, it sounds like there is a level of discomfort with that it is a potential, at least potentially, a sign that they're not showing trust in you. I
think it's more
your voice tone, the way that you were speaking, the language that we're using, use of indicate.
Yeah, I think
it's entirely comfortable when that happens.
I think it depends on where the long handled screwdriver is coming from. So if I'm dealing with one stakeholder and they've asked me to do something, and then the long handled screwdriver comes out, then it's usually a source of amusement of long handled screwdrivers out. And then I look at what I do to try and work that back. Is there a way we can do this so that I can be left to do what I need to do, and then report back to you or check in with you at agreed moments that we've pre-agreed, rather than just turning up at my desk or throwing an email
Try
at me.
And re-establish those boundaries.
Yes. What are the boundaries? What are the tolerances? It's different if I've got one stakeholder who has provided scant direction to a collective of people, and I'm one of that collective. Where that happens, I usually try and step up and say, "Oh, let me get that, and I can work with everyone." Where in the occasions where they're not keen on, they want everyone to be equally involved, and then you've got people who are then doing a sideways long handle screwdriver. That I tend to sort of find that frustrating, and that's where I'll tend to say, well, if you're so determined that you want to be involved in my stuff, it is presumably because you've either got a deep passion about this or deep expertise that I'm missing. And if it's things that I always sort of say, what are the things you're prepared to die in a ditch about? If it's something that I'm prepared to die in a ditch about, then, I will sort of stand my ground and say, no, absolutely not. But if it's those things where you go, this clearly matters to them more than it matters to me, I'll work out how I can row back out of it and go, well, they really want to do my stuff. Let them do it. Let me do something else. There's no point, for me, there's no point in me being frustrated, trying to do something that I'm not that passionate about when there's someone sat a few desks over there who's absolutely passionate about it and clearly is. It'd be different if they were wholly incompetent, but that's rare. That's rarely the case. And if they were, then those would be the things where I'd stand my ground. But if they are equally, immensely capable of doing this, and it's just where the dice have fallen, well, please go ahead.
Presumably, you've come across cases where somebody's very passionate to take on something that you're doing, and it isn't because they intrinsically care about the subject or the project. It isn't because they have capability, but it could be for something to do with political positioning, personal gain, that sort of thing.
Yes, I think there are. I suppose I'm less driven. I've not found myself really driven by political positioning. So even if they're wanting to do it for nefarious reasons, then I still stand true to, is this something that matters? Is this something that matters to me? And if it matters to me because I think I am absolutely the right person to be doing this, then that's where I'll stand my ground. And if it's a case of anyone could do this, any of my peers could do this, or that person over there is better placed, then I always think it's about the best person to be doing whatever it is.
Mm. And whilst that may not have always served you politically, at least it's kind of kept the peace.
It keeps the peace and it keeps me sane. And so yes, probably from a political perspective. Yes, it may well be a challenge, but then the thing I'm passionate about is something that's pretty niche. My passion is workforce planning, people analytics. They tend not to, you tend not to have a lot of them at the same level in one organization, and that's what I want to be. I've not got. I'm not using it as a stepping stone to something else, whereas others might. They might be in one role and they've got visions of, I like doing what I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a good way of minimizing interference as well.
Yes, have a career that elements of it are so complicated that people just don't want to be involved, and indeed in an HR world do things with data, because people tend to try and keep away from that.
Very interesting. So really the theme, we started talking about effects-based thinking. We talked about responsibility and delegation. And I think where we've ended up is the theme seems to be really around how to carve out a niche in your career that other people leave you alone to do something that you get pleasure out of doing.
Yes.
Very nice. Very nice.